All right. Well, tonight's presentation is from our NWSOFA Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group. NWSOFA stands for Northwest Suburbs, that's of Chicago, Organizing for Action. We were founded about 11 years ago, right after the Barack Obama 2012 election cycle. We organized some folks that were making calls for him. I think there was 17 of us at Panera Bread right after the election, and we decided we'd become a progressive group of some type. Our group, as I said, started with 17. We now have over 5,200 members and growing because of Zoom all across the state and across the country. And today we even have a person on from Ecuador. So we have extended greatly. NWSOFA's core group is in 6 townships, an area from Schaumburg, Roselle, Hoffman Estates, Wheeling, Des Plaines, up to Palatine, Barrington, and that includes Arlington Heights, but there are 6 basic townships. And we are fortunate that as we've grown over the last 11 years, we've taken on not just one progressive issue, but we now have 11 progressive issues. The group that we'll be hearing from tonight, our 2 leads, Karl Faulstich and Dave Doney, have really done an excellent job over the last 5 years, driving the conversation forward, presenting the facts, and really increasing this to a from my perspective, one of the best economic and fiscal discussions that is available today. And so let's move forward. Karl, I just introduced you. Why don't you take it away? Welcome,
thank
everybody.
you, Bill. Welcome, everybody. Our December meeting, and I will try and get these slides moving appropriately. We're trying to give you the facts to be able to discuss the economy with your friends, cohorts, enemies, whatever, either in person, commenting on articles, and what have you. Tonight, we're going to cover the labor market, GDP, gross domestic product, inflation and wages, other economic statistics, do a little bit on income inequality, and then some action steps that we can take. Job creation has been good. The U.S. added 199,000 jobs in November. Prior months were adjusted down slightly, but we are now at 157 million jobs. These are payroll jobs. The pre-pandemic peak was 152 million, so we're about almost 5 million more jobs than before the pandemic, 4.72 million. And from the trough, we're up quite a bit, about 17 million jobs. It was at 27. So anywho, what we can see is that we've been adding jobs, but this is the 3-month moving average, this is the line, and the number of jobs we've been adding has been declining over the last couple of years. If you all remember, we lost in 2 months in 2020, we lost 22 million payroll jobs. And so we were recovering from that through the middle of last year, and we've been building on those jobs since then. So this was about when we recovered the prior peak, but these numbers are still very good. I mean, 200,000 jobs a month, 199,000 is almost 2.5 million for the year. And if you look at pre-pandemic years, that would be a good year. Give you some idea of average monthly job gains. In President Obama's second term, he had averaged 216,000 jobs per month. In Trump's first 3 years, he averaged 182,000 jobs per month. And because of those 22 million jobs lost in 2 months, over his 4 years, he averaged a loss of 56,000 jobs a month, which was the first net jobs lost since Hoover. Biden has had much stronger, but even once we fully regained the jobs that had been lost during the pandemic, it's still been stronger job growth. Unemployment, which went up a little bit, I think, due to the auto worker strike, has come down a little bit. So it went from 3.9% to 3.7%, and that's the U3 rate. As most of you know, the U3 unemployment rate is people who have not worked during the month but have looked for work in the past month. The U6 rate are people who have not worked in the month but have looked for work in the past year, plus people who are working part-time who want full-time employment. So that's why it's higher than the U3 rate. Okay, and here's some, I'll let David speak on this one because I'll confess I'm not that familiar with the SOM rule.
Yeah, so the SOM rule has some interesting, it's really a way of tracking whether you're in a recession or not. And it has, the math is a little bit complicated. And Karl, are you still sharing? Did I lose?
Still sharing.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me maximize this thing. There it is. Okay, so it uses a 3-month averaging mechanism. And what you're looking for is the 0.5 level. And so when that number, the SOM rule hits 0.5, that's when you tend to know that you're in a recession. So when you see the trend on here, the unemployment rate has been creeping up a little bit lately. And so it's been moving up. However, because it uses this 0.5, this rolling average method of computation, you really need a spreadsheet to analyze this, or you have this handy Fred chart that does all the math for you. But you can see where it says up at the top, SOM rule identifies signals, and it's 3-month moving average rising by 0.5 percentage points relative to its low during the previous 12 months. And so you need to be able to controlling, which is easy enough to do with a spreadsheet. And then you need to see what it is in the last 3 months. You're always kind of doing this comparison. It's a little tricky to use, but what it's saying here is we're not in a recession. The number is 0.3. It's been creeping up. It's not 0.5. And in the past, looking at the lower right, the recent, the recession that started in March 01, the rule triggered in June 01. When the recession started in December 07, it triggered in April 08. And the recession started in Feb 20, it triggered almost immediately. It's triggered in April. So it's usually a couple months of lag. You'll know you're in a recession when it hits 0.5, and it's very reliable. But it's not a forward indicator, meaning it doesn't say a recession is coming. It says you are in one based on how much higher the unemployment rate is when you smooth it out. Claudia Sahm is very active on Twitter. She was a former Fed economist. She does a lot of TV work and writing now, and she's a great follow on Twitter. If you're not following her, she's really handy. But she's a fairly young lady and has a rule already named after her. So she was joking on Twitter that her kid was asking her if she's a one-hit wonder, if she's going to come up with another rule. We'll see. But this is the current state, and it's okay. I don't think I have it on here, but if we had a 4.3% unemployment rate in last month, that would have caused the rule to trigger, and the unemployment rate went down from 3.9 to 3.7, as Karl mentioned. I'll stop there.
So there is a question for Karl and David here. Sonny Cohen says, without being rude, does any of this data matter when Biden's approval rating is at an all-time low? And then he had a second.
He's jumping
question.
the gun.
Okay,
Sonny, it's the right question, right? It is the absolute right question. We're going to have a fairly lengthy discussion of it because, and if you've been in this session before, you know that the economic data is way, way better than the sentiment indicators. And it doesn't matter. And so people are scrambling right now to try to understand that. And we'll have a bunch of slides on this a little bit later. So I would say hold that question and we will come back to it. But we're going to give you the good news first. We're going to give you the facts, which are going to tell you this is an excellent economy. And then we're going to show you those sentiment indicators and try to get at why. Because right now, economists don't know, to be honest. There is no study that is definitive that says it's for these reasons. It's your guess is as good as mine right now.
Okay, I would just question people that the SOM rule is not the official definition of a recession. It is not the rule that the National Bureau of Economic Research uses. Yeah, but it's probably a better.
NBER, go ahead.
And the NBER looks at 6 different metrics, and it tends to take a long time. For instance, the recession that started December of 07, wasn't called until after the election in November of 08. So this is a potential early indicator of recession, and it may be helpful from that standpoint, but it is not a definitive indicator of whether or not we're in a recession.
And there's no rule, to Karl's point, the NBR does not have a rule that says when the statistics look like this, you're in a recession. They make a judgment call based on these 6 key measures that we'll share. I think we have a slide on it in this meeting. If not, we had them in the last few. And all 6 of those indicators are showing growth for the year. They're all up versus where they started at the beginning of the year. So there's no indication of recession. This is when you look at this data, we're in a boom. We'll show you the GDP data in a little bit. This is a booming economy. People don't like it for various reasons, and everybody seems to have a different one. So we'll get back to that. But there is no rule. You probably heard in the news a few months back, it was early 22. I think, was it early 22, Karl, or 23 when we had 2 down quarters? It was 22, right?
Yeah.
And we had 2 down quarters, and people said, well, that's the rule for a recession. And it is in some countries, but it's not in the United States. That's not our rule. There is no rule.
And there also is another question in the chat from Sonny asking what is the impact now that the European Union leaders are indicating that they are entering a recession, if any?
So far that has not affected us. I mean, when we get to end of January, we'll see what our GDP growth was in the fourth quarter. But certainly our third quarter real GDP growth is anything but a recession, as we'll see in a few more slides. But it does raise an interesting question that if everybody at the meeting could help us on later on, apparently 60% of the people in our country think we are in a recession.
Crazy.
So,
yep.
I mean, that's the polling.
Yep.
So how do we correct that? But we'll move on for the moment, and you can think about that one.
Yep. Yeah, and the euro area is not in a recession right now. They are expecting it to be, and we'll see how that goes.
So we saw the actual unemployment rate a few slides back, and this is just average for these are calendar years?
Correct.
Okay.
You have to go back to 1969 for a 3.5% unemployment rate. 3.6 is extremely low.
For an annual average, yeah.
Yeah, it's even low for a month. But but we've had a bunch of them lately. But historically, we didn't have an unemployment rate below 4.0 for 30 years. From about 1970 to 2000, we never had an unemployment rate in any month below 4. Okay. So this is extremely low, any way you look at it.
Okay, we looked at the payroll jobs before, and I think they were 157 million payroll jobs. And here we see that the household survey says we've got 161 or 162 million total jobs. This includes 1099 employees, your Uber and Lyft drivers, all you folks that are doing Grubhub, and deliveries that are not by employees of some company, but are independent contractors. So if your pizza is delivered by Domino's, that's probably a payroll employee. But if it's delivered by Grubhub, that's probably not in the payroll employees, but is in the household survey numbers, or estimated to be. What we see is that the labor force grew at a decent pace in November, 532,000. More importantly, the number of people employed grew by 747,000. So the employment to population ratio grew a little bit. The number of unemployed shrank, and the number of people not in the labor force shrank. And I'm not sure how much of this is the settlement of the auto worker strike and putting those people back into the payroll jobs. But anyhow, good data, all positive. Again, the employment to population ratio is probably a better number to look at than the unemployment rate, especially when the unemployment rate it can include people who are older. The key thing about this prime age group is it tends to take out students and retirees. And so you end up with a better sense of how the economy is doing, because your 18 to 24-year-olds or your 16 to 24-year-olds, a lot of them tend to be students, and above the age of 54, you tend to get retirees. Now, that's not to say you don't have 35-year-old grad students and 36-year-old early retirees. But by and large, this is a pretty pure people that you would expect to be working, unless they're stay-at-home moms or people like that. And we've got job openings at 8.7 million last month. The number of people who were counted as unemployed was 6.5 million. So there's more job openings than are unemployed, and we see a little ratio of 1.34. And why don't all the unemployed have jobs? Skills, inertia looking, location looking. When there were lots of jobs for fracking up in the North Dakota, and not a lot of people up in North Dakota, and not a lot of available housing up in North Dakota for the people who did want to move there, those were some factors that kept those jobs from being filled. Okay, do we have questions about the labor market? Do we want to have a little bit of discussion about the labor market, or go on to GDP at this point? Well, I can't see if anything is popping in chat. I'm counting on Bill to tell you about that. Otherwise, we'll go to GDP, gross domestic product, and this is real gross domestic product, i.e. adjusted for inflation. And this is what David was talking about. We had a minor decrease in real gross domestic product in the first and second quarters of 2022. Since then, we've had solid growth, and then really good growth in the third quarter.
Karl, I was on mute. I apologize for that. There is a question from Anita Bank. She says, do you have a racial breakdown of the statistics on slide 10?
Okay, let me go back to slide 10 and see what that was about.
I see that David had posted a Bureau of Labor Statistics.gov news release. I'm going to guess that covers that.
That has it, and I'm going to put a Fred slide in there that shows the unemployment rate by race. So I'm working on that right now, so that you have it. But the details of all those numbers that are on slide 10, those are on that first link I've provided, and I'm going to give you just the unemployment rate by race. That'll give you a sense of it. I mean, the African American unemployment, for example, hit the lowest level ever under Biden, and it's not there now. It's come up a little bit, but it hit. I think it was 5.4. I've got to get the slide here, but I'll know it. But it's across all the races, they're all seeing very good improvement. It's not limited to just one group.
Reminds me when I covered labor economics in college back in the 70s, full employment was a 6% unemployment rate.
Right. Yep. I mean, the average is 5.7. I mean, it is incredibly low unemployment. It's an awesome time to be working.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got very good GDP growth, which says, no, we do not have a recession. And that 5.2% in the third quarter, breaking out its components, consumer spending is the biggest part of it. And the one thing that pulls it down a little bit, well, we've got exports and imports. So but by and large, pretty much everything was contributing to growth in the real GDP in the third quarter. Now, these numbers come out, if the third quarter ends on September 30th, the first estimate comes in the last week of October, the second estimate came in the last week of November, and the third estimate will come in the last week of December from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And then they continue to accumulate data. And so a year or two later, they'll go ahead and revise numbers. And all of a sudden, those numbers that you knew and you had committed, they change on you. And you go, what the frick happened? But that's because they are continuing to revise it. And just an example of how the Biden administration is messing with those numbers. When Trump left office, the it showed that the real GDP growth under Trump was at 1.6% for his 4 years. And after the Biden administration messed with the numbers, it's now up to 2%. So they actually moved things in Trump's favor. But I'm sure that our friends on the right won't believe. Real GDP has been growing. It came back in early 21, got to the pre-pandemic peak, and it's basically been growing since then. Slight downtick in the beginning of 2022. We're about 7.5% higher than we were prior to the pandemic. And this talks about the fact right now, we're not seeing any scars from the pandemic on real GDP growth. That prior to the CBO did a projection back in January 2020, before the pandemic, and our current real GDP level is higher than they projected it would be at this point. So,
to that question, Karl, there is a couple comments and questions from Glenn Riley. To everyone, he says Joseph Stiglitz believes that GDP is the wrong marker to determine actual economic growth. He believes that we should be using other markers that center on citizens' well-being, such as housing, poverty, health outcomes. Maybe the disconnect, friends, good market versus people's pessimism, close friends, is that current markers that we look at does not really jive with what is actually going on in the streets. And then there's a couple comments, one from John and one from Mark Lundholm. But I'll let you guys take that first one.
Okay, I haven't read that from Stiglitz, but let's postpone a discussion of that until we get into the inflation versus wages discussion in the next section, because I think that gets into the how is it affecting people's households a little bit, and addresses that to a certain extent.
Okay, and then John says the value that H. sapiens receives from nature is double that from GDP, mostly human activities. Is there an economist, university, business group, etc., that focuses on rational analysis that is working to include this omission? And then he's got a link there from Science Direct.
I have not seen anybody who has put that into the economic statistics. I mean, I've read a little bit of that idea, but no one's figured out how to quantitatively.
Yeah, I know that John brought that up the other day on our 9 o'clock coffee and conversations, and it was very interesting. Mark Lundholm added a comment. He says there seems to be some expert comments that much of the current polling is highly inaccurate, hence suspect. And a couple of replies on that. Let me see who replied. Oh, that was one of his to Vanita, I think.
Well, I mean, if I do not have a house phone, so a pollster has to call my cell phone. And if I get a call from a number I generally don't answer it, unless I'm expecting a call from a number I don't recognize. So
we have a question.
Who are ducking calls.
Yeah. So Amy says, do things like student debt and credit card debt and mortgages factor into how people receive how people perceive how the economy is doing? And there was a reply to that from David Doney that I think answers most of that. Thank you, David. You are quicker than I am. on
No,
this.
I'm working on it. I'll try to help, because these are key questions, and we'll get into these a little bit, as Karl mentioned, and I'll be revisiting these questions, and we'll be talking about them in this meeting. There is always a cottage industry to find new measures to explain why the economy is bad and why the measures that are normally used are bad. For instance, Karl and I share the U3 and the U6 unemployment rate, and the U6 is something that isn't really all that useful, but it became a big deal during the Obama era because people were seeing the unemployment rate falling, and Republicans were arguing that's not the real unemployment rate. And so they started coming up with the U6. I see a lot of people arguing that the participation measure that Karl showed earlier, they like to show the labor force participation for the entire population of age 16 plus, saying that number is going down. Well, that number is going down because the country is aging. So there's not much point in using that number. You use the one that Karl and I shared. And so people will keep finding a new reason to say, here's why people are angry, and you just have to rebut them one at a time. Like housing prices, and that's the point that I made here in the chat, 2/3 of Americans own, 2/3 of households own living. So 66%. And housing prices, even adjusted for inflation, are way up. And we'll share the net worth statistics with you later. That's way up. So that is housing. There's a lot of noise about it because if you're a millennial looking to buy a house and they're very expensive, housing's not very affordable for you to buy a home, and you're stuck paying a higher rent than you had to. But if you're one of the 2/3 of Americans that own your home, and your home's up $100,000, then you're kind of like, this is awesome. So and that's the majority. 2/3 are happy, should be rationally happy their housing prices are up, and the other third is, understandably not happy about it because they don't own an asset that's going up. So you have to go through these kind of and look at them. One of the items mentioned was poverty. The poverty rates are not particularly different than they were before the pandemic, about the same. 2019 was the record lowest poverty year. But if you look at 17 and 18, our poverty rate in 22 is consistent. Health outcomes, I'm not as familiar with those. I know the age has been falling, but that usually isn't a main driver. Like, you don't ever see that come up as somebody saying the life expectancy is falling, and therefore I'm very unhappy with how the president is doing. I've never heard that, like, ever. I've seen it in the news, but that isn't usually something that connects with so we'll talk about inflation. Rent is a legit issue that people have. If you're a renter, it sucks that rent is up so much. But on the other hand, we're going to show you wages, which are up more than inflation. So,
So
we'll
David,
get there.
you'll probably want to put this question from Anita also. She says, I'll just start it. She says, inflation has cooled a lot, so why do things feel so expensive? And then she put a current NPR article, I actually myself, as to what the disconnect is out there. And when we get to inflation, you may want to go back and address this.
Yeah, we will. Let me just give you a preview. That is, clearly prices are still up. Inflation is the percent change in the prices, usually measured over a year versus the prior year, is the headline, 3.1% or whatever. But prices are still 18% or so above where they were in 2019. People might like that, but we'll show you the wages are up even more. So if somehow you manage to dodge getting gigantic wage increases, you're one of the unfortunates that did, and you also got hit with the inflation, then that's bad. But not everybody experiences inflation the same, and not everybody experiences wages the same. If on average, our wages are up more than inflation, then on average, people should be happier than they were in 2019. And I'll stop after I say this, is fundamentally the thing is that in 2019, all these economic measures that we're sharing with you today, we're in better shape on nearly all of them than we were in 2019, yet sentiment is much worse. And that's kind of the disconnect, is these things were not all that different or are better now than they were in 2019. Why the big gap in sentiment? So I'll stop there.
Okay. And I'll just make one comment about buying a house, which is, I mean, they're used to, well, heck, 2, 3 years ago, interest rates were 3%, and now they're up at 7.5% or whatever they're at currently. It's not something I look at, but at our coffee and conversation, a number of us have talked about what the first interest rate we had on our home loans back in the 80s, and they were more like, oh, I came in at 86 and it was down to 10%. I think Bill and Jim were up around 18%.
Right.
So by historical standards, I mean, my dad, when we bought our house in '67, was really glad that he was able to negotiate a 6% mortgage. By historical standards, this is not that high a mortgage, but by 2, 3 years ago standards, it is.
So two more quick questions. Mark Lundholm says, gasoline and egg prices are way down. Jewel and Mariano's prices seem very increased. Insurance is way up. Housing availability is tight. Lack of supply. Of course, I suspect Biden is sitting there manipulating prices behind the curtain. Very good, Mark. And then Glenn says, but is the housing asset inflated to the point of the bubble? Think 2009 recession. Even though they can sell their house for a larger price, the market that they want to buy into may still be unaffordable to them. And I'll just say that a couple quick comments. Loretta says, agreed, price gouging. On the good news, she paid $2.89 for gas today. And Susan Quigley says, my first house, 1984, rates were 14%. I qualified for first time and was happy to get 7%. Okay.
Yeah. Well, one thing in terms of housing availability is that you've got a lot of people that have, 3% mortgages right now. They may be looking, their kids may have, graduated college and they're empty nesters and they might like to downsize. But if they've got a $200,000 mortgage at 3%, they downsize by $100,000 or whatever, but they're now getting it at so they now have $100,000 mortgage, but it's at 7%. Their mortgage payments will go up by downsizing if they have to take that hit on the interest rate. And so that's a big part of why a lot of people are not moving out of existing houses right now because they can't afford because of the interest rate hit.
And just to note, those of you who are following chat, David put in a explanation to Vanetta about the perception, which he'll cover later on.
Okay, and this is a real quick one about real GDP growth versus pre-COVID. And what we see is the United States has had the best GDP growth of any of the G7 countries since the onset of COVID. And this is the real GDP growth, Obama's first term, Obama's second term, Trump pre-pandemic, Trump full term. Like I said, this used to be 1.6%, but and then Biden so far is at 2.83%. Historically, going back, Obama was at 2.1% full term. Bush 43 was at 2%. No, he was at 1.8%. His dad was at 2%, and Clinton was at 3.7%. Going back further, Reagan was at 3.4%. Carter was at 3.4%, because we all know what a terrible economy we had under Carter, if you believe myths and popular perception. And real GDP per capita, again, it fell during the pandemic, came back up, and is now about 6% higher than it was. But again, this is average. And, as I like to say, you, me, and Bill Gates have an average net worth in the tens of billions of dollars. Average may not mean a whole lot. Median is a better number, but what the heck, we use this. Okay, we're up to inflation and wages. David, do we want to people from this area, and then break, or take a break now?
Yeah, let's break around 9, and then
Okay.
we'll go from there. I'll move through these pretty quick because I want to get to that discussion that people are interested in having here. So the inflation rate in the last 2 months have been practically zero, meaning sort of the price level is sort of flattened out. Even if you were to multiply that 0.1 by 12, that's 1.2 annualized approximately inflation, which the Fed would love to have, and I think all of us would love to have 1.2% inflation. And as I've said before in these meetings, it's always a battle every month of rent versus gas prices. Gas prices were down, rent was up, but the gas prices overwhelmed it. That was the big factor, and the shelter wasn't big enough to do this. So, it's getting better. It's coming down.
The gas
Karl,
prices are down over the year, and food at home is only up 1.7% for the year. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, do you want me to? Well, I guess since we only got a couple minutes, I'll share when we get back from the break. So yeah, if you don't mind, go to the next slide.
Okay.
And these are now versus a year ago. The last page was versus the prior month. And so you've got a 4% core and no change from the prior month. And then the CPI all is down to 3.1. So you can see, though, these lines have been slowly falling for the past year, meaning the inflation rate has been coming down. And it looks like, let's see, in the quote down below, where's the number I'm looking for? It's not in there, but the rent is usually, well, that's the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, or it's an upcoming slide. But rent is really where the action is in that core number. It's like half of that core inflation number is from rent. It's what's driving the core inflation is really rent. It's a heavily weighted thing. Not every one of these items on this page is weighted the same. And rent is very heavily weighted in that core number. So you can see it's rent. The energy stuff looks good. I put those in green. The used cars and trucks have also come down over the past year, but rent shelter is still a problem. And that's where the action is. Next slide. And this is where we get to see the contribution over time. And you can see as you get more recent, that dark blue housing section is really the rent and what they call the owner occupied equivalent rent or whatever. But it's all, half this inflation now is rent. So those little chunks of bars add up to that 4%. I'm sorry, this one is CPI. So they add up to 3.1, and it's coming from these areas, and housing being the big one. And we've talked about it in the past. It changes with time. Like for a while, energy was the big one there. If you go back into the early 2022 area, first half of 2022, it was energy, and that sort of went away as gas prices had fallen. They've actually gone negative, and now you're seeing the rent really take over. Early on in the thing, people were all buying stuff from Amazon, and so that dark blue was a big deal in 2021, and now that's gone away. So it's sort of like one thing hands off to the other, and the thing that's causing problems now is rent, housing. Next slide. All right, so wages, if you look at, and these are worker wages, meaning it's about 80% of the private sector. The name of it is at the top there. Production and non-supervisory employees, total private, it's about 80% of private sector workers, and it's the bottom 80%, meaning this is not skewed by those few managers that make $1 billion. It's the bottom 80%. Wages, those have outgrown CPI, and they've way outgrown the CPI core. So this says that you've got more purchasing power if you just look at wages, and that's not the only thing to look at, but it's an important thing to look at. The hourly wages are indicating you have more purchasing power now than you had in 2019. This technically starts at February of 2020, but February 2020 was better than the rest of 2019, was better than 2019, better than the months before it. This is telling you that you've got more purchasing power now despite all those price gains. So when somebody screams, milk's up, X percent, yep, wages are up more. Every time they say this stuff costs this much more, it's, yep, but wages are up 22%, and overall, yeah, you can find some stuff that's up more than 20%, but there's a lot of things that haven't gone up 20%. And, that's where we are. So wages are up. Let's keep going. One of the things that the media did a horrible job of explaining is they've been saying incessantly, and this is a big part of the sentiment, that real wages are falling under President Biden. And that is a true statement, or it is a factually accurate statement, but it is horribly misleading. And this is a nice slide that Justin Wolfers did. He's an economist, often on TV, he's very well regarded. Now, real wages are higher than 2019, as this shows you. This is real, so this is inflation adjusted. And that's the dollar amount on the left-hand side, the hourly rate. But they were very distorted by what happened in early 2020 when millions of low wage workers lost their jobs. And so this average went up. They call this a compositional change. You take all the low wage people out, and of course, the people that are left are the more expensive ones. They're driving that average up. The higher wage people drive that average up. And it's been coming back down, but it is still above where it was before the pandemic. And so again, sentiment was really good in 2019. It's lousy now, but real wages are higher. So let me keep going. This is one slide that illustrates this. I like this one better. This goes back all the way to 1964. And real wages aren't like GDP that has sort of always been climbing with the occasional interruption. You know, real wages peaked in the early 70s, then they came down for decades, 2 decades plus. And the last couple of decades, they've been going up. And they're at about 97th percentile historically right now, $29.30 an hour. All of these numbers are in today's dollars. They're all in November 2023 dollars. And this is extremely high. So the media is talking about this little decline here in the upper right corner, saying, you know, woe is Biden. The real wages are falling. It's like, guys, they're 97th percentile. They're better than 97% of our history. They're very high. So you got to look at level. You can't just look at changes over a short time window, especially one that's so distorted, as I said on the last page. Next slide. This gives you the actual, this one will give you the actual Biden versus Trump comparison. So when you go and look at Trump's entire term, the real wage was averaging $28.34, and Biden is averaging $29.19. And bear in mind, Trump, his average got a benefit of that really high spike, and Biden has gotten an advantage in that 2021 frame of that plateau there, sort of on that next level down from that very high peak. People don't know this, but 2021, the annual average, and you can see it in this graph if you look at it, it's not labeled this way, but 2021, that is the highest real wage for a year ever. How many of you heard that in the news? Nobody, because nobody talked about it. You have to come here to hear this statistic. I still haven't seen it. It's never on Twitter. Even on Twitter. So this 2021 was the highest real wage ever on average. 2020 was just behind it. And now 2022 and 23 are right behind that. So it's 2021, 2020, and then the last 2 years. So Biden's got 3 of the top 4 years of real wages. So it's his getting beat up on real wages has been a terrible disaster that we were not able to get in front of as a community because the media is just talking about the drop. That's all they're saying, and everybody's supposed to be upset about it. And it's a shameful piece of bad analysis by the news media. Next slide. And here's just the average for 2023 versus 2019. So same concept as the last one, just the latest average. And so up about $1 an hour, not quite, 80 cents or so, about 80 something cents. But that's more purchasing power than we had in 2020 and 2019 when everybody was happy, allegedly, with the economy. In 2018, Trump started saying that the economy in 2018 was the best ever. And you can see just looking at this graph, just this one measure, that in 2019, it was better than 2018. And look at 2023, greatest economy ever. I would love it if Biden would start saying that every day. There's a cottage industry of people that say if 10% are suffering or 15% are suffering, you got to acknowledge that. You can't just talk about the 85%. It's like, you know what? Got to market, my friends. Market the data. Market the weapons you got. Use them. All right, next slide. All right, and this is an international comparison, kind of like Karl showed earlier with GDP. In general, we're doing much better than other countries. We are recovering much better. And let's give credit where it's due. Don't pass the Rescue Act. That kept our economy out of the trench. It really kept things from, it allowed us to recover really quickly. Let me put it that way, better than out of the trench. We went into the trench on employment. We got out of this a lot better because we spent all that money and put money in people's pockets, and both the Trump and Biden administrations did that. Next one. All right, let's pause there. Well, no, we'll finish this section. We're almost done with this. This is a piece of really excellent news that normal people don't care about, but it's the Fed. this is the expectations of inflation over time, the 5 and 10 year, and what people are thinking the inflation rate's going to be over that time frame. This is based on what bonds are telling us. I mean, these are people betting enormous sums of money on bond purchasing. This is what they're telling us. And the way they do it is technical, it's written down there, but it's really the inflation expectations are back to that nearly that 2% level. They're at about 2.1. Whether you look at 5 or 10 years out, they're very close to each other. Like one of them's 2.1, the other one's like 2.2. They're very close. And that is really an excellent piece of news that is down from where you see that peak there at 3.5 in 2022. And you can see kind of where the Fed sort of forced itself into action. If you drew a vertical line about a third of the way past that 2022 line, right where the interest rates start going up, you draw a line up, that's pretty much where the peak of the inflation expectations were. When the Fed saw that coming, they had to act. They couldn't let that thing keep climbing, and they got it down to where they want it. And they'll be watching this. The good news for them is that this is weekly data. They can get this stuff, and the Fed might even have it more often. They probably have models that do this daily. They might even have it hourly or real time, but they can get it weekly and see what they need to do. Things are headed the right direction on this measure. Next.
David, before you go
Yep.
much further, did you want to take the questions that are coming up on inflation here?
Let me take them after the break.
Okay.
Let me look at them during the break and come back to it. So I will. There was a comment earlier about price gouging, and the media does. The people, economists think price gouging is a baloney thing because they sort of think corporations are going to do the corporate thing and they're just going to raise prices as much as they can. Now, so they sort of shut mentally down. They've got that mental construct in their brain and they're not really listening. What you see when you analyze the data, and you can see it here, corporate profits as a percent of GDP, corporates got more profitable. If you look at what happened in 2021, 2022, and even now in 23, those are much elevated over where they were in 2019. And when you do the math, if you try to figure out what could this be per household, there's the numbers are crunched down there. I'll give you the bottom line. It's about $2,700 in extra costs because of those corporate profits. In other words, those prices going up, not just the profitability amount of dollars, but the profit rate went up. And that's 2023, which is not as high as you could see there in 2021 and 2022, which were 2 or 3 times as much, meaning this was costing households $6,000 to $8,000 a year more than otherwise. So certainly corporations not just raising their prices, but raising their prices more, increasing their profitability rates. And this is just one way to look at it. This was my calculation, but I ran it past a real economist, and he said, "Yeah, this is pretty reasonable" on Twitter. He said, "Good back of the envelope calculation. He didn't have a better one." I'm like, okay, that makes me feel good. But this is just math. I mean, it's $3,000 to $6,000 a year per household is what corporate price gouging is costing us, if you want to use that term. One more, I think, is I'm going to end this section. We're real close, I think. Yeah. So let's stop there. Let me digest the questions we're getting, and we'll come back from the break and address them.